Why shoreline regulation matters more than many waterfront buyers realize. You can own 100 feet of Lake Michigan frontage, a beautiful beach, a spectacular view, and discover that the property doesn't behave the way that you expected. Because waterfront ownership and waterfront usability are not always the same thing. Most waterfront buyers start with the same things: the beach, the view, the sunset, the frontage. Those things matter. But after years of selling waterfront property throughout northern Michigan, I've noticed that the long-term ownership experience is often shaped by something else entirely: how much of the property you can actually use. And that's where waterfront starts behaving differently than many buyers expect. Today, I want to introduce you to a simple way of thinking about waterfront property. Buyers see frontage. Buyers assume usability. Constraints compress usability. Understanding changes, value changes. Once you start looking at waterfront property through that lens, a lot of waterfront behavior begins to make more sense. Waterfront ownership versus waterfront usability. One of the reasons this matters is that truly usable waterfront is much scarcer than many buyers realize. Northern Michigan can create new houses. It cannot easily create new usable waterfront. And that's one reason why waterfront prices often seem irrational until you understand what the market is actually competing for. Because the market is not simply competing for frontage or the number of front feet, it is competing for flexibility. Two waterfront properties can both have the same frontage, the same body of water, similar views, yet these two different properties can provide completely different ownership experiences. The market rewards frontage, ownership rewards usability. And the difference between those two things explains why similar waterfront properties often produce very different ownership experiences. Waterfront value is not determined solely by frontage. It's determined by how much of the property remains usable after access realities, environmental conditions, setbacks, bluff conditions, and other constraints are applied. The Frontage Trap. One of the most expensive mistakes waterfront buyers make is assuming frontage and usability are the same thing. I call this the Frontage Trap. The Frontage Trap occurs when a buyer sees a frontage number and assumes the frontage fully describes the ownership experience. Imagine two waterfront properties. Each has 100 feet of Lake Michigan frontage. One has easy beach access. The other sits on top of a steep bluff. One has a large buildable area. The other has a compressed building envelope. One offers relatively straightforward redevelopment potential, while the other contains multiple limitations. Same frontage, different asset. The frontage number didn't lie, it simply didn't tell the entire story. And that's where buyers often get surprised. The usability compression effect. What makes waterfront property complicated usually is not just a single restriction. It's when multiple constraints begin stacking on top of one another. Every individual limitation reduces flexibility just a little bit. A setback reduces flexibility. A bluff condition reduces flexibility. A septic limitation reduces flexibility. An access issue reduces flexibility. Environmental review requirements reduce flexibility. Individually, each one of these may be manageable by itself, but together they begin compressing usability. And eventually, the ownership profile changes. This is where many buyers discover that the property behaves differently than they expected. Not because the property changed, because their understanding of the property changed. Why truly usable waterfront is scarce. Many people assume waterfront scarcity is simply a frontage issue. I don't think that's entirely true. The real scarcity is usable waterfront. Waterfront that simultaneously offers desirable shoreline, practical access, manageable setbacks, septic feasibility, redevelopment flexibility, and long-term durability. That combination is rare, and that rarity creates value. In many situations, the premium isn't being paid for the waterfront itself. Instead, the premium is being paid for flexibility. Cathead Bay, what buyers see. Let me use a real-world example, Cathead Bay. From the road, a property on Cathead Bay can appear straightforward. From the shoreline, it can look even better. Exceptional frontage, a beautiful sandy beach, a highly desirable stretch of Lake Michigan shoreline. Many buyers stop their evaluation right there. And that's understandable because what they see is very attractive. But what buyers see is only part of the story. Cathead Bay, what the property allows. Once you begin evaluating property more deeply, additional layers emerge. Critical dunes, building envelope considerations, septic replacement complexity, Bluff-related considerations, redevelopment limitations, access realities, ownership versus usability. None of those constraints necessarily prevent ownership. What they do is change the ownership profile. The property didn't change. The information available to the buyer didn't change. The interpretation of the property is what changed. And that change in interpretation can affect how buyers evaluate value, flexibility, and future possibilities. The beach didn't change. The understanding of the beach changed. That distinction matters because buyers ultimately pay for what they can realistically use, not just what appears to exist on paper. Why older waterfront homes sometimes have hidden value. One of the biggest misconceptions I hear is this: if I don't like the house, I'll just tear it down and build a new one. Sometimes that's possible. Sometimes it isn't. Many older homes were built under a different regulatory environment than what exists today. In some situations, the structure occupies a location that would be difficult or impossible to recreate under the current rules. That changes the valuation discussion because sometimes the value isn't the house. Sometimes the value is where the house already sits. That single idea has enormous implications for waterfront valuation. Bluff access and the 10-year question. Many buyers evaluate access by asking, can I get to the beach today? I think that's the wrong question. The better question is, will I still be able to get to the beach 10 years from now? Because the existence of access and the durability of access are not always the same thing. Maintenance matters. Physical conditions matter. Future replacement considerations matter. Long-term durability matters. Sophisticated buyers don't simply evaluate current access. They evaluate future access. Good Harbor Bay, future access. I represented the seller of a waterfront property on Good Harbor Bay where stairs already connected the bluff to the shoreline. The stairs remained usable, but eventually replacement would become a consideration. The stairs were nearing the end of their useful life. The buyer asked a very smart question. What happens when these stairs eventually need replacement? At that moment, the buyer was no longer evaluating the beach. The buyer was evaluating future access. Those are two very different things. And that shift in thinking is exactly what separates surface level evaluation from deeper waterfront analysis. Hidden access complexity. I've also seen situations where a stairway down from a bluff crossed onto a neighboring property. At first glance, everything looked normal. There was access, there was a beach, there was a path. But underneath that simple appearance were legal agreements, maintenance obligations, neighboring rights, and future considerations. Again, the beach didn't change. The understanding of the beach and waterfront property changed. And this is why waterfront access deserves as much attention as the number of front feet or the waterfront frontage, because access often determines usability. What sellers often miss. Waterfront sellers often focus on frontage, views, square footage, renovations. Those things matter, but sellers frequently underestimate the value of features that would be difficult to recreate today. Things like existing stair systems, grandfathered structures, approved septic locations, established building sites, proven access solutions. The harder those things are to recreate, the more valuable they become, because they preserve flexibility, and flexibility is valuable. Closing. Most buyers initially evaluate waterfront property through appearance. Long-term ownership, however, is shaped by usability. That is the larger pattern. Buyers see frontage, buyers assume usability, constraints compress that usability, understanding changes, value changes, and in many waterfront transactions, that shift in understanding is what ultimately changes value. The beach didn't change. The understanding of the beach changed. And in many waterfront transactions, that shift in understanding is what changes value. The market rewards frontage. Ownership rewards usability. If you'd like to go deeper into this topic, you really have 3 different options. I've written a full article on this particular topic. I have a waterfront guide available, and I have my book, Growing Up on the Water. All 3 of those things are on my website. If you're interested in receiving a printed copy of my book, just shoot me a message in the comments, and I'll make arrangements to get you that. That'll be coming out soon. In each of these different publications, I continue breaking down how waterfront property actually behaves throughout northern Michigan.